guys, it's Tori and today I'm doing my September Bookopoly-thon wrap-up. I ended up completing 9 books this month, which is incredible for me. Apologies in advance if you hear anybody walking around. I am in my parents' basement right now, so people are walking upstairs. You may pick it up on the sound in this video, but hopefully it won't pick up too much. Anyway, let's just get right into this because like I said, I have a lot of books to talk about. The first book I completed this month was A Rose for the Crown by Anne Easter Smith. This is a romance focused around Richard III. Specifically, it follows Kate, who is the fictional mother of Richard III's real illegitimate children, and Anne Easter Smith just decided to give her a story because we actually don't know anything about the parents of his illegitimate children. We don't know if there were multiple mothers, if there was just one, and we certainly don't know her name or their names if there were multiple. So definitely, of course, right up my alley, and I ended up giving this about 3.5 stars, 3.75 stars. I enjoyed it quite a bit. I actually really liked Kate as a main character. She lost me in a few places, but I overall really enjoyed reading from her perspective. I also really liked exploring the Wars of the Roses from this more third-party, separate perspective. I've of course read several things, seen several things about the Wars of the Roses, about Richard III, and so I've of course seen a lot of things about Wars of the Roses and Richard III, and most of them take place from the perspective of one of the active players of the Wars of the Roses. So it was kind of nice to just explore the time period from a perspective where she's not in the middle of it. She's hearing a lot of these things through rumor, through other friends and family who are connected with the court. But mostly we're kind of just exploring this time period for the more average person. Of course, she is still connected with nobility, and so there's a level of that in the story. It's not like she's a peasant woman, but she's a lot closer to being a peasant woman than any of the other figures in Wars of the Roses. So it was really interesting to explore this time period from her perspective. By the end, I did like Richard's portrayal in this. I will say one of the things I didn't love was the way their relationship developed. Really, they only meet with each other a couple of times, and it's kind of like seeing each other across the room, and then when they're a little older they end up running into each other in the forest, but there's no real opportunity for them to really get to know each other. And so by the time they have a sexual encounter together, they don't really, like, I don't feel like I know Richard as far as Anne Easter Smith is trying to portray him in this book. Of course, I have my preconceived ideas of him, so I could kind of put that on here. But in the book itself, I don't feel like I really knew Richard as a character at all by the time they had this sexual encounter. So while it's trying to make their relationship so romantic and they're just in love with each other, I just didn't feel that way because I didn't feel like they actually had real conversations, at least not on page. Most of their interactions during their relationship is just having sex and having sexual encounters, which is fine, but like if you're going to build this up to be a perfect, loving romance, I need to see more in-depth conversation. I need to see them building that romance before they have a sexual encounter. In fact, I honestly don't feel like I got to know Anne Easter Smith's version of Richard until after they had stopped having sex together. Like when they still met up afterwards, but they had stopped having sexual encounters because he was married now and she wanted to respect that and he did too. And so most of that time was spent with them just having conversations, and that's when I felt like I actually got to know Richard. So that was a little issue I had. I also didn't love the way Anne Easter Smith wrote dialogue in this book. I think she tried really hard to use kind of more old-fashioned language in the dialogue, but it was done in a way that just pulled me out of the story instead of pulling me into it like I think she was trying to do. In fact, in the author's note, she says she wanted to pull people into the time period by using this sort of dialogue, but for me it actually pulled me out of the story because it just made me think, oh, this author is trying to write this way. And even excusing some of the technical side of the dialogue, just the way people interacted and spoke to each other just felt strange to me. Like it just didn't really feel very natural to me. And it felt like it was definitely a situation where everybody's in love with Kate. Everybody just adores her. She's just an amazing person. And so every interaction she has with pretty much anyone, they always like her. And I'm like, I would have liked a little bit more, like some people maybe don't like her because of this relationship with Richard. Like they have an issue with it. I just think her dynamics with other characters could have had more depth and been more interesting, whereas all of them kind of felt the same. And in fact, there were a lot of kind of like father figures in this story that all felt the same. Like they all felt like the same character. I could separate them well enough based on their names, but for the most part, like they all just felt very much the same personalities. The women honestly too had pretty similar personalities, although I feel like there was a little bit more dynamic with the other women in the story. Oh, another thing I did like though, there's a servant girl in this who has a deformity, I guess you would call it. It's basically a big purple birthmark on her face, but she has such a sweet romance. Of course, there's aspects of it that for me personally don't really draw me into a romance, but there was a lot about it that did, and I really liked her dynamic with her guy. The theme of motherhood is also very strong in this, and I really loved those aspects. I felt like Kate had a really wonderful relationship with both of her children, all of her children, and her relationship with each of her children did feel different, and I appreciated that exploration. Also, her connection with the mother figures in her life were just wonderful to explore. But overall, yes, it was a wonderful read, and I will definitely be willing to revisit it in the future. I will keep my copy, even though it wasn't even quite a 4 stars for me. It was good enough, and I'm glad I read it. Okay, talking about that book took way too long, so the rest I'm gonna try to shorten what I say, especially because most of these, if not all of them, I did speak about in my September reading vlog, so I will link that down below if you haven't seen that yet and want more details on my thoughts on these books. But the next book I completed was The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Brontë. This was a reread for me, of course. Actually, I listened to this on audiobook this time and really enjoyed that experience a lot. And this has just been solidified as one of my favorite books. I just love Helen Graham as a character. I guess I should tell you what this is about in case you don't know. This story starts off in the perspective of a young man named Gilbert, who is part of this small country village town community situation. And one day, a mysterious woman and her son move into a local home called Wildfell Hall, and there's a lot of rumors going around about her, of course, because she's a single woman living alone. And over time, Gilbert gets the opportunity to learn more about this mysterious woman and her tragic past. Like I said, I love Helen Graham as a character. I just think she's so strong and yet very herself, if that makes sense. She's not putting on this strong front most of the time. Sometimes she has to, but it all comes from this center of her belief system, her faith, along with her love of being a mother and just being a good friend and person in general. There's a lot of this that is difficult to read due to the subject matter it is addressing, but it is a wonderful story with wonderful characters. I know a lot of people don't like Gilbert, and I definitely understand why, but I think it's interesting because he's writing this in the future, so it's older him looking back at younger him, and I kind of appreciate that as a narrator he doesn't shy away from his childishness and naivete at the time, but you can also see that he still maintains some of those flaws that he had in the past, and I just really like how human that feels. And overall, it will always be one of my favorite books. This, Wuthering Heights, and Agnes Grey will definitely always be my top 3 favorite Brontë novels. The order of them will probably continue to change depending on my mood each day, but this is one of my favorites, and I'm so happy I got to read it again. Then I ended up listening to the audiobook of The Sign of the Four by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. This is the second in the Sherlock Holmes series, and I did really enjoy it. Did I enjoy it as much as the first one? Maybe a little bit more. The first one had some things that I didn't love, but overall I think Sherlock Holmes is just fun. Like, it's just entertaining to listen to Sherlock Holmes mysteries. They're probably never going to be some that I like absolutely adore, but they're always going to just be entertaining, and I really appreciate that about them. This one in particular follows a missing treasure trove, and it was just a lot of fun. It also was very interesting because there were a lot of similarities in the plot to The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, which I just recently read. So it was interesting to see how those two stories spoke to each other. I will say there was some cultural insensitivity in this, particularly towards Middle Eastern and Indian culture. I can't remember exactly where it was, but it's around that area, and so that was unfortunate. But ultimately, so worth the listen, and I'm glad I finally have completed this first volume. It has both the first and second novels. So now I can move on to some of the others that I have. In fact, I may end up going through Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, which is the next book, but the first short story collection in the Sherlock Holmes series. And I might do that for Victober, depending on how things work out. So anyway, very glad I was able to get to this. I am excited to continue with the series. All right, I'm gonna continue this, but my little cousins just arrived, my sister sister and my mom are watching them. I'm gonna help, of course, as well. But they did just arrive, so you might hear little voices in the background. Anyway, let's get through this. The next book I completed this month was Yellow Wife by Sadeqa Johnson, and this was definitely a highlight of the month. This story follows a slave girl named Phoebe Dolores Brown, and she is the daughter of both her mother, of course, as well as the slave plantation owner. So she and her mother have a lot of hope for her future because the plantation owner is aware that it's his daughter, and so he has plans to hopefully one day provide greater opportunities for her. And so there's all this hope, and yet, of course, tragedy strikes, and she ends up in a very different situation to what she expected to. Based on that synopsis, you'll probably be aware that this is a very difficult book to read. There's a lot about it that is very uncomfortable because of the situation she's in. But first of all, I did really like Sadeqa Johnson's writing style. I feel like for a book like this, there's a certain writing style that I see in a lot of popular historical fiction. I should say more popular commercialized historical fiction that I just don't really like, and I don't really know how to describe it beyond saying it's kind of a like amateurish writing style, which I hate to say because these people obviously are great writers. A lot of people love their books. But there's just something about it that doesn't feel it just doesn't flow very well for me. It doesn't pull me into the story as well. But this one definitely was very well written, which I absolutely appreciated and loved. Phoebe as a character is wonderful to follow. I really found myself just falling more and more in love with her as the book went on. At first I was a little bit concerned because a lot of it felt like just, I don't want to say any other slave book, but kind of. Nothing about it was super standing out to me, basically, and so it was a little hard for me to get into at first. But then halfway through the book, something happens that totally switches the dynamic, and it adds a whole new perspective to this topic that I think is discussed a lot in many different formats, that I've experienced a lot in many different formats, and I really appreciated it. In fact, Phoebe Dolores Brown is based on an actual figure by a different name. I can't remember what her name was. But Phoebe's experiences are based on what the author learned about this other woman from that time, and it made it extra fascinating to learn about that. This is one that I would highly, highly recommend. I absolutely loved it. Definitely a highlight of the month, if not my favorite book I read this month. I did have a couple of others that I really enjoyed as well, but I think this one had the most impact on me. This one and one other one, I guess. But yes, I absolutely loved this. Then I completed Edgedancer by Brandon Sanderson. This was another very strong highlight of my month, although this one I did give closer to like 4.25 stars, whereas Yellow Wife got 5 stars from me. This is a novella following one of the characters from Brandon Sanderson's Stormlight Archive series. Specifically, it's one of the characters that is highlighted in one of the intermissions in the second book. And it's a character that actually really did stand out to me a lot, and so when I saw that there was a novella about her, I was really excited, and I absolutely loved the journey this book took me on. And it honestly reminded me how much I love Brandon Sanderson. Like, I really need to get more back into his works. It's been a long time since I've read much by him, and that needs to be fixed for sure, because reading this, it just took me back into this world and back with these characters that I love, this magic system that I've been falling in love with. I guess I can mention the character's name is Lift, and she actually is showing up, I think, a bit more in later books in the Stormlight Archive. Again, in the third book, which I have already read. I have not read the fourth book yet, but I'm assuming she's going to be in that one a lot more. So it was wonderful to get this transition book where we're able to see her in a little bit different light than what we saw in the intermission in Words of Radiance. I absolutely adored seeing her growth, and I'm excited to see how she continues to grow throughout the series. Next, I had a DNF, unfortunately. That was for The Witches of St Petersburg by Imogen Edwards Jones. The story follows 2 women who are sisters who actually lived in Russia during the time of kind of that last Tsar of Russia transition into the Bolshevik Revolution, Rasputin, all of that. They're involved in that time period. I read about a fourth of this, and unfortunately I just did not care for the characters. I felt very apathetic towards the characters, towards the plot. It really felt like a lot of work to get through this, and so when I got to that quarter of the way through, I was like, let me read some reviews and see if it's worth continuing. And a lot of those reviews just mentioned that about halfway through this book, it becomes a bit of a sex fest, particularly with Rasputin, who hadn't even shown up, by the way, by the time I got 120 pages pages in, despite the fact that he's very clearly mentioned in the synopsis, and so that was another issue. But a huge sex fest with Rasputin just doesn't really ring like something that I would like to read. And one of the reviews actually had a description of Rasputin and his male member that was just not particularly intriguing to me. It was actually really gross. There was also, in the 120 pages that I read, a really gross scene that was just honestly so unnecessary, and I just, yeah, very turned off by this book. Ended up DNFing it, unfortunately, and it was actually for a role that was for lowest rated from my TBR, and now I know why it is the lowest rated. So unfortunately I did DNF this and will definitely be getting rid of it. Then I completed another audiobook, which was I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jennette McCurdy. This, of course, is a memoir about Jennette McCurdy, and particularly both her experience with her mother as well as her career as an actress and performer. If you don't know who Jennette McCurdy is, she played Sam Puckett on the popular sitcom TV series iCarly, and this was a very harrowing read. I know a lot of people have just spoken glowingly about it, while also acknowledging that it is describing very triggering things about eating disorders, mental health, abuse, physical, emotional, even sexual abuse, and child exploitation, really. And it was just very harrowing, like I said, to read, but very well written. It was very, very engaging. I know a lot of people talk about being weirded out by rating memoirs because you don't want to put a rating on someone's life experience, but to me, when I rate memoirs, it's usually based around the way it's written. Is it written in a way that's engaging? Because you can have a very interesting life, but you can write about it very dryly. So to me, that's kind of what I base it around, is more how it's written and explored, and is it done in a way that is engaging and enjoyable to read. As far as, you know, the experience of reading it is enjoyable, maybe not necessarily the content is enjoyable. And this definitely had all of that. I will say my one, it's not really a critique, I still gave this 5 stars, and this little thing about it that sort of bugged me was very much had nothing to do with this book itself or with Jennette McCurdy herself. It's very much just my personal life experience and how it didn't quite match up with hers. And I wanted to mention it because other people may have similar feelings, and it's just nice to be forewarned about that. Basically, she does discuss religion a lot in this book. In particular, in the beginning, she talks about the religion she grew up in, and I actually am currently part of that religion. And she just describes things in a way that, first of all, are worded in a way that I wouldn't necessarily word them or view them. Additionally, she just comes across as very sarcastic and bitter when talking about that religion in particular and our beliefs, but also in general, just religion in general, she ends up becoming kind of sarcastic and bitter about later on in the book. And while her experience is totally valid, and I don't want to dismiss it, and that's why it didn't impact my rating at all, when there's something that is that close to your heart and part of your personality, it just makes you cringe a little bit and a little bit sad when people treat it in a very bitter and sarcastic way. So I just wanted to mention that. Again, it didn't impact my rating because it's her experience. Her experience is very valid, and I don't necessarily have an issue with it. Just as a listener, as a reader, it made me sad to hear that, and I know other people probably might be a little bit triggered by that sort of discussion. So yes, just wanted to mention that, but overall this was a great read, definitely a favorite of the year. So glad I ended up listening to it. I then finished an audiobook of Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. I really enjoyed this. It was kind of middle of the road for me, particularly for this month, but I'm glad I listened to it. It was very interesting to see the Holocaust through a more philosophical, kind of scientific perspective. I mean, Viktor Frankl experienced all of these things firsthand, so it's not like looking at it as a third party. He's looking at it as someone who experienced it, but he's trying to explain some of his philosophical and psychological ideas about human beings. And so he takes a little bit more of a scientific approach, but you're also learning about these very harrowing experiences, and it's just done in such a human way while also being very scientific and kind of, I don't want to say objective, but that's the closest word I can think of right now to what I'm trying to say about his writing style. The second half, where he kind of focused more in on describing his philosophy, was a little bit dry to me. I didn't necessarily love that portion, but I mean, there were parts of it that I still enjoyed. I find with philosophical texts that they end up feeling a little bit redundant by the end, and that kind of ended up happening with this one. Luckily, I feel like it ended just before it would have been been like kind of actually obnoxious, but that is something I wanted to mention. But yeah, overall, glad I read this, listened to it, and I hope one day to be able to get a physical copy that I can more in-depth study now that I have a general idea of what this book is. And the final book I'm going to mention is The Girl in the Tower by Katherine Arden. This is the second book in the Bear and the Nightingale series, which I read the first one last year and really enjoyed it. I guess technically it's called the Winter Night Trilogy, but anyway, I will say with the first one, even though I enjoyed it, by the end I didn't necessarily find myself itching to pick up the next one. I was just like, I definitely do, but maybe eventually. It doesn't have to be right now. This one ended, and I'm really looking forward to reading the third and final book in this trilogy. This trilogy follows basically the life and growing up of Vasya, who is this very wild girl. It's set in medieval Russia, and she has the ability to see these mythological creatures that are part of the folktales, fairy tales, legends of this area. Meanwhile, Christianity is of course coming in, and there are some very overly zealous religious people who come in and start stamping on the old religion, the old pagan ideas. And Vasya is trying to save this hidden world that she has grown to love. Having read the first two in the series, I understand why a lot of people end up being disappointed by this series, but I also understand why a lot of people really love it. I'm finding that this series, it's not overly focused on the plot. I mean, the plot definitely plays a huge role and is really wonderful to explore, but it's more about focusing on Vasya as a character, medieval Russia as a setting, Vasya's relationship with her family, and exploring just the world of these folktales and legends from this area of the world that a lot of people are probably not very familiar with. Even the plot itself is exploring just a lot of different legends within this time period and within Russia as a country or a kingdom at this time. And it's just beautiful. Like, Katherine Arden just writes so beautifully. I absolutely love her style. I love Vasya as a character, and her dynamics with her siblings are just so interesting. And I really like her siblings a lot as well. We're able to get a few portions of this book from the perspective of her siblings, not just in Vasya's perspective, as well as some other characters. And I really like the exploration that's going on in this story. And the atmosphere, of course, is just wonderful. That just kind of wintry, icy, snowy, fantasy kind of feeling is just brilliantly done, and yeah, I'm so excited to continue with this trilogy. I ended up giving this about 4.75 out of 5 stars, so not quite 5 stars for me. Maybe the third one will be different. I guess one other thing I do want to mention about this is this actually contains a romantic trope that I don't usually like very much, but the way it's done in here is just very good. I really like it. So that's another comment I wanted to make on it, but yeah, overall loved this. Definitely another highlight of the month, and I don't know when I'll read the third one. Hopefully it's not in another year, like between this one and the first one, but whenever it is, I am sure I will just devour it and love it. So that is all I read. This video is so long, especially compared to my other wrap-ups. Part of that, though, is because I really could not speak in this video. I would have cut it all out, but like, if you had seen it, I was just struggling a lot. Anyway, that's what I ended up finishing in September. It is actually the 24th of September, so I still have like a week left in the month, but I'm just so excited for Victober that I'm just starting my Victober reading. So yeah, that's what I'm doing the last week of the month, and I'm just not going to finish anything in this next week because even if I get close, I'm gonna save the last page or two for the first day of October so it can count towards that. I will be starting Bleak House by Charles Dickens, and I have already started A Lady of Quality by Frances Hodgson Burnett. We'll be sharing my thoughts on those, of course, in next month's wrap-up, as well as in my vlogs next month, so be looking out for those. If you've read any of the books in this video, please let me know down below your thoughts on them. If there's any books you read recently that you loved that you would like to recommend to me, please do. Thank you again so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!